What up, YouTube fam? Back with another video, and in this one the good folks at K&F Concept sent me a variable ND filter to test out, and I thought in testing out this filter I would make a video to go over the things that I look at to determine if a ND filter is going to work for me. Now, my standard for ND filters is a B&W filter. I have been using B&W filters for 10 years now. I have B&W UV filters on all of my lenses, and I specifically made a point to say that just to irritate somebody that I have UV filters on all of my lenses. Someone's going to be annoyed by that, so I thought I would mention that. But B&W has been the standard for me for filters. I've done a lot of testing with my B&W filters, so I know how they work in conjunction with my lenses, and I don't have any issues with them. So when I'm testing out this K&F Concept ND filter, I will be comparing that to the performance that I get from my B&W filters. Now, in saying that, my B&W filters, for the most part, are almost double the cost of this K&F Concept filter, and I don't even have any variable ND B&W filters. They're all just, a single stop of ND. So I'm not expecting the K&F Concept to necessarily outperform the B&W, although it might. But it really is more of a benchmark to see, is these ND filters, are they a value for the money? So I believe at the time of making this video, this is a 1 to 5 stop variable ND, and this is their Nano series that has the multi coatings and the anti-scratch and all of that. At the time of doing this video, I believe that it's like $70 on Amazon. I'll put that on the screen if it's something different. So we'll see how this fares in comparison to the B&W. Now, before I jump into that, when it comes to ND filters, one of the main questions that I get asked is, does ND filters degrade image quality? Does it have an impact on image quality? The short answer to that is yes. Any filter that you put in front of your lens is going to have an impact on the image quality. You're taking a lens that has been specifically designed with the elements that it has, and you're putting something in front of it. There is going to be an impact to the image quality. But the real question is, to what degree? If it is a good ND filter, the impact to the image quality will be so negligible that you either won't be able to tell, or you'll have to really pixel peep and do a lot of work to be able to tell, in which case it really doesn't make a difference. So with my B&W filters, in all of my testing, there really hasn't been any noticeable image degradation, and that's really what you want with these filters. You certainly wouldn't want to spend $1,500, $2,000, $3,000 on a lens just to put a filter in front of it and it degrades your image quality. So when it comes to filters, yes, there is an impact, but the question is how much? The second question that I tend to get is there a color cast? And for the most part, you're almost always going to have a color cast when you're using an ND filter. You are taking a tinted piece of glass, hopefully glass, not plastic, but you are taking a tinted piece of glass and putting it in front of your lens. So that is going to affect the color temperature to some degree, whether it warms up your image, cools it down, has a magenta tint to it, a green tint to it. There's going to be some sort of tint, but that really isn't anything to worry about because that can be handled with white balance. If you put the filter on your lens and then you adjust your white balance, it really is going to neutralize that. So that's not really anything to worry about, but that is something to note. Now, the first thing that I look at is build quality. What materials are used to make the ND filter? Now, when it comes to any filter that you put in front of your lens, you're really going to want to get something that is of pretty good quality, because again, you don't want to degrade that image. So the K&F Concept filters, the rim of the filter is made of aluminum, which is nice because it's lightweight, and then the actual part of the ND filter, I was going to say the front element, but it's not a lens, but I'll say that for the sake of not knowing what I really want to say. The front element is glass. Now, your cheaper filters will be made of plastic entirely. So the frame of the filter will be plastic, the lens will be plastic, and those are the ones that you're really going to see more image degradation just because it's plastic. And if you've ever looked through glass versus looked through plastic, when you look through plastic, it's not as sharp, there's not as much contrast. So you do typically want something that is going to be built well. Now, in comparison to my B&W filters, the rim on these filters is actually made of brass, which is a little bit stronger than aluminum and more durable. And the glass is made by a company called Schneider. So it's a really good glass. So in terms of weight, my B&W filter is 1.5 ounces, where the K&F Concept is 1.8 ounces. So 3.3 ounces more, but there's actually 2 pieces of glass in this because this is a variable and my B&Ws are not. So that just goes to show the construction of this versus this, but this is very well designed. It feels really good. It definitely feels like it would be durable. So that is nice. So the next thing I'm going to look at is, am I getting the number of advertised stops for the ND filter? And this is real important with the variable ND because obviously you're rotating the glass and that's what's giving you these different levels. When you have just a single stop, you typically are going to get what's advertised because it's a lot easier to perfect that. But when you have this variable ND, things get a little different in that regard. Now, when it comes to testing this, there's 2 ways that I typically do it. One is kind of the more sterile way, where I essentially will point my camera at a white foam core board and I will light it and I will test it that way. And then the second way is more of in the environment, where I'm just trying to see, what I get looking at a landscape with the blue sky and that sort of thing. Now, the issue with the latter is that when you're outdoors, number one, the light can change. If the sun goes behind the clouds, or just there's a lot with being outdoors where that light isn't necessarily consistent. So that can have a little bit of impact on your reading. The second thing is that camera meters are not as accurate as you would think. Now, it's essentially just looking at the scene. And even if you have it on spot metering, it's looking at the scene and it's trying to decide what your settings need to be. So they're not as consistent, and that's why I like to use the white foam core board. And typically what I will do is use live view, and as I'm going through the stops, I will look at the histogram and basically get the settings to be where they need to be to get the histogram in the same spot every single time. And so then that way I know that the exposure is consistent, and then I look at how many stops of light difference each one was. So as you can see here, for the K&F Concept filter, at 1 stop there was a 1 1/3 reduction of light. At 2 stops there was a 2/3 reduction. At 3 stop there was a 1 stop reduction. At 4 stop there was a 1 1/3 reduction, and at 5 stop there was a 2/3 stop reduction. Now, you may be looking at that and saying, man, it's not consistent on the number of stops lost, and it isn't. And the one thing that you do have to keep in mind is that as you're turning these variable ND filters, it is getting darker as you turn. So there are markings on the filter itself, but as you're going from one marking to the next marking, you are getting a shift in how much light is being reduced. So I don't really worry too much about the stops from each of the markings. What I'm really looking at is, am I getting the total number of stops lost? And in this particular case, I am still getting those 5 stops, which is very important. So even though it's not exactly 1 stop from marking to marking to marking, you are still getting essentially 1 stop at the beginning and 5 stops at the end. And that is the most important. Everything else in between, you'll get what you get, and you can just put it wherever you want to put it to be able to get the exposure down where you need it to be. So the next thing I look at is color cast and vignetting and lens flare. Now, as I mentioned earlier, color cast is not really a big deal. It's not something that I worry about, but I do like to know what type of cast the filter is going to have, just so that way I know, just in case if I need to do something settings wise or something creatively, whatever the case may be, I want to know what the filter is going to do. And in terms of vignetting, that's not really a huge deal because obviously in stills, you can easily fix vignetting, and even in video you can fix vignetting to a degree, and for the most part it's really not that distracting. Most times you don't even notice it if it's not terrible vignetting. And lens flare, depending upon the coatings that they have on it, the lens flare can be really bad, and that's an issue that you'll run into with any filter. If there's not quality coatings on that, you are putting again a piece of glass in front of your front element, so you are going to get reflections off of your filter hitting your lens. So depending upon how good the coatings are, you could have minimal to no flare, or you could have really bad flare. So in terms of color casting on the K&F Concept, it definitely warms the image up. So there is a little bit more of a red and green cast, so it warms it up. Whereas, you know, my B&W filter, it has more of like a greenish tint to it, almost cools it down a little bit. So not really a problem. I don't really have any issues with the filter warming my images up. Again, this can easily be fixed in stills or video, doesn't really matter. So I really didn't see any additional vignetting with this filter over top of the lens without a filter. It really was comparable. I do think there is slightly more vignetting, but nothing that I would absolutely be concerned about. And the lens flare handled lens flare very well. I basically tested this with the filter and then without the filter, and I really was getting similar characteristics in the lens flare. I do think to a small degree there was a little bit more lens flare with the filter on, but even with the coatings, that really is to be expected. You have two pieces of glass that you're putting in front of your element, so naturally you're gonna have some sort of reflection, especially when you're shining a light directly into the lens. No matter what type of lens coating you have, you're gonna get lens flare if you're shining it right into the lens. Now after that, I'm looking at sharpness, because at the end of the day, that is somewhat the most important thing. Am I still going to get as sharp of an image using the filter as I would without the filter? And to be honest with you, this is where I really thought that these filters were going to fall apart a little bit, just because I know my B&W filters do very well. I basically have no sharpness loss that is visible. So I really wasn't expecting this to be able to compete with the B&W filter, but I was pleasantly surprised that it did. In testing using the filter versus without the filter and comparing the images, I really didn't see any reduction in sharpness. Now I will say that there was a little bit loss of contrast. So without the filter, the blacks were definitely a little bit punchier. But in terms of sharpness, I really didn't see where this affected sharpness at all. Now, when I'm testing this, I essentially just use a lens sharpness calibration sheet, and I put it on a wall and I basically focus on it. And I actually used a macro lens for this, because if there was one lens that was going to be good to test sharpness, a macro lens would be it. But in terms of comparing the two, there really wasn't any difference between using the filter and not having the filter. And I think that's probably the biggest praise that I can give to these filters, is that you're really not losing any sharpness, and that's key. You know, if you're using a filter and it really is degrading your image to the point where you're losing sharpness, then you're really having to decide what is more important, cutting down your light using an ND filter or sharpness. And in my opinion, you shouldn't have to make that decision, because there are filters out there that allow you to get the benefit of the ND filter and also maintain your sharpness. So you really shouldn't have to compare. And I definitely have to say this handled very well. Now, in comparing the chart using this filter versus the B&W filter, The B&W filter was just as sharp, but I really felt that it maintained the contrast. The blacks were just as black with this filter as without, so that's where the strong suit is. But for this filter being double the cost, I have to say this filter held its own, and I'm very happy at the results that I got from this in terms of sharpness. So the last thing I want to talk about is weather sealing, and that probably isn't the right word because there isn't any weather sealing in this. But when you have a variable ND, you have two pieces of glass. So that means that there's air in between the two. So the same way that you have to be aware of your lenses when you're going from really cold to warm or really warm to cold, you have to be just as aware when using a variable ND filter. If you go somewhere to the point where you're going from one temperature extreme to the other, or you're in a very humid situation, you can get condensation that will form in between the two pieces of glass. And unless you can get that condensation to dry out, there won't be anything you can do, and you can end up with a very foggy variable ND filter that is kind of rendered useless. So with the filter at this price point, you're probably not going to get as good of a seal between the two as you maybe would with something more expensive. So you do have to be very aware of where you're using these. That's just the nature of having a variable ND and having two pieces of glass pushed together. If you get any kind of moisture inside of there, it's probably going to wreak havoc on your filter. So that's just something to keep in mind. So my overall thought on these K&F concept filters, they get a check mark in my book. And I'm not just saying that to say that. If they didn't work for me, I would tell you they didn't work for me, and you would never see me use this filter, because I'm not going to use a filter that is going to affect the performance and the outcome of what I'm trying to do. And so I would definitely let you know if I did not approve of this, and in all the testing that I've done, it definitely is a very good value for the price point. Now, again, it's not as good as my B&W filter, which it's almost not even fair because this is just a single stop. So of course I would expect this to perform very well over a variable ND. But for the price point, I think that this is a good bang for your buck. Now, is this going to be the best variable ND filter that you can get? Probably not. Is it going to compete with, the Peter McKinnon Polar Pro line? I can't say because I don't have it, but probably won't perform as well as that. So it really depends on what your standards are. But if you're really just looking for a solid variable ND filter, the K&F Concept, the Nano series. Now I know they have a bunch of filters apparently, so I can only speak for the Nano series. Anything else I can't speak for because I don't have that, but this Nano series line, very, very good filters. So hopefully you found this video helpful. I appreciate you watching. Again, thank you to the folks at K&F Concept for sponsoring this video. And until the next video, take care.